The sun had barely set when two police cruisers pulled up to a quiet suburban neighborhood. Their headlights cut across the neatly trimmed lawn of a modern two-story house. Inside the driveway stood a man in a sharp suit, carrying a briefcase, calmly walking toward his front door after a long day at work. But the officers didn't see a homeowner, they saw what they thought was a trespasser. "Hey! You can't be here," one of the cops shouted, stepping out of his car with his hand hovering over his holster. The man stopped, raised an eyebrow, and said firmly, "Excuse me? This is my property." The officers exchanged suspicious glances. "Don't play games with us," the second officer barked. "Step away from the house right now." The man sighed, clearly irritated but keeping his composure. "I live here. I've lived here for years. You have no right to tell me otherwise." But the officers didn't back down. Instead, they advanced, one of them pulling out handcuffs. Neighbors peeked through blinds as the scene unfolded, sensing something unusual. What no one knew, least of all the two cops, was that this man wasn't just any homeowner. Within seconds, they were about to discover the shocking truth. The officers moved in quickly, their boots crunching against the gravel of the driveway. One of them barked, "Hands where we can see them," as if the man were a threat. The man calmly set his briefcase down and lifted his hands. His face remained composed, but his eyes revealed the simmering frustration of someone who dealt with nonsense before. "This is my house," he repeated firmly, his voice steady but cutting through the air like steel. "Everything on this property is mine." "You are making a mistake." One officer scoffed. "A mistake? You're about to be arrested for trespassing. Now turn around, hands behind your back." The neighbors across the street whispered in shock. They knew the man who lived there, quiet, private, but always polite. Nobody in their right mind would question his ownership of the house. Still, the officers ignored him. They reached for his wrists, ready to slap the cuffs on. The man tilted his head slightly and muttered under his breath, almost as if he were warning them. "You really don't want to do this." The officers hesitated for just a second, confused by his confidence. Then one of them smirked and snapped, "Oh yeah. And why's that?" The man locked eyes with them, his calm demeanor shifting into something sharper. "You're about to find out." The cuffs clicked around his wrists, cold steel biting into his skin. The officers thought they had control, until the man looked over his shoulder with a faint, almost knowing smile. "Gentlemen," he said evenly, "I suggest you run my name before you take another step." The cops exchanged a quick glance, but one of them just shook his head. "Save it. We've heard that excuse 100 times. Everyone says there's somebody important." Still, the man didn't resist. He let them guide him toward the patrol car, his posture calm and upright, as if he were humoring them. As they reached the vehicle, he added quietly, "Call your supervisor. Right now. Because in about 30 seconds, your radios are going to light up, and you'll regret every move you just made." The younger officer rolled his eyes, shoving him gently toward the back seat. Big talk for someone about to spend the night in a cell. But before the man could even sit down, the first crackle came across their radios. "Dispatch to Unit 12. Confirm location. Is that address secure? Be advised, you may have a high-level individual on site." The officers froze. The man raised an eyebrow, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. "Told you." The two officers stiffened, exchanging uneasy glances as the dispatcher's voice continued over the radio. "Repeat, Unit 12, you are currently detaining a federal official. Identify immediately and stand down until further instructions." The man slowly turned toward them, still in cuffs, his expression a mix of calm authority and sharp warning. "You have about 10 seconds to take these off me," he said quietly, "before this situation becomes a career-ending mistake." One officer swallowed hard, suddenly unsure. Who exactly are you?" The man leaned closer, his voice low and deliberate. I am the director of the FBI. And you just put me in handcuffs, on my own front lawn. The words hit like a thunderclap. Both officers went pale, their confidence draining instantly. One fumbled with the keys, his hands trembling as he tried to unlock the cuffs. The other officer muttered, "No, no way. This can't be real." He looked around at the neighbors peeking from behind curtains, realizing the entire block had just witnessed their blunder. The man straightened his suit jacket as the cuffs finally came off. He fixed both officers with a stare so sharp it made them look down in shame. "Now," he said coldly, "shall we talk about accountability?" The air grew heavy with silence. The officers, who only minutes ago had been barking orders, now stood frozen like statues. One finally stammered, "Yes, sir. Director, we didn't know. We were just..." The man cut him off with a raised hand. His eyes burned with authority. "You didn't know because you didn't check. You didn't ask for ID. You didn't verify anything. You saw what you wanted to see, and you acted on it." The second officer shifted uncomfortably, his voice breaking. We thought you were trespassing." "Trespassing? On my own property?" The director's tone sharpened, his voice echoing across the street. Neighbors leaned closer to their windows, barely daring to blink. He stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "I deal with national security threats every day. I work with agents who risk their lives for this country. And tonight, I come home, to this. Harassed, humiliated, in front of my neighbors, because you couldn't follow basic procedure." The officers dropped their gazes, their earlier bravado gone. One of them whispered, We're sorry, sir." The director's jaw tightened. "Sorry won't erase the fact that you crossed the line. And believe me, this won't be forgotten." The director pulled his phone from his jacket pocket, his movements calm but deliberate. He tapped the screen, and within seconds, someone answered. "This is Director Hayes," he said firmly, loud enough for the officers to hear every word. "I need the duty commander dispatched to my residence immediately. We have a situation." The color drained from the officers' faces. The younger one whispered, "He's serious." "Oh no." Hayes ended the call and turned back to them, his voice steady but ice-cold. "In a few minutes, your supervisor, and my federal security team, will be standing right here. Then you'll have to explain why you put the head of the FBI in handcuffs on his own property." The officers shifted nervously, beads of sweat forming on their brows. The street had gone silent, even the neighbors had stopped whispering, their eyes locked on the unfolding drama. One officer tried to salvage the moment. "Sir, if we had known, we never would have." "That's exactly the problem," Hayes interrupted, his tone sharp. "You don't act on assumptions. You verify. You confirm. If this is how you treat ordinary citizens, then we have a much bigger issue than what just happened to me." The weight of his words hung in the air, crushing what little confidence the officers had left. And then, flashing lights appeared at the end of the street. Reinforcements were arriving. The red and blue lights washed over the quiet neighborhood as another police SUV pulled up, followed closely by two unmarked black vehicles. Doors opened in unison, out stepped the duty commander and, from the other cars, federal agents in plain suits with earpieces glinting under the streetlights. The neighbors gasped. This was no ordinary call. The commander stormed over, his boots hitting the pavement like drumbeats. "What in the world is going on here?" he barked at the two officers. Before they could stutter an excuse, Director Hayes spoke, his tone sharp but composed. "Your officers detained me on my own property. Handcuffed me, humiliated me, and did so without a single verification of identity." The commander froze mid-step, his eyes widening as realization sank in. "Director Hayes?" His voice dropped. "Sir, I didn't know you lived here." Hayes turned his piercing gaze on him. "Clearly, neither did your men." The two officers looked like they wanted to melt into the pavement. The commander's face flushed with anger, not at Hayes, but at his own team. You two, what were you thinking? Did you even run a check? The younger officer mumbled, we thought. Exactly, Hayes cut in. You thought. You didn't confirm. And tonight, you learned just how dangerous assumptions can be. The federal agents stepped closer, their presence commanding silence. The balance of power had shifted completely. The commander's jaw tightened as he glared at his officers. Do you have any idea what you've done? He hissed. You just put cuffs on the director of the FBI. On camera. In front of witnesses. The younger officer's lips trembled. We didn't mean. Intentions don't matter now, Hayes snapped, his voice carrying the weight of authority. What matters is the abuse of power, the lack of professionalism, and the damage this causes. Not just to me, but to the trust between citizens and the police. The neighbors were now gathered in small clusters on the sidewalks, whispering in disbelief, phones raised to record the scene. Every second added more eyes, and soon, the entire world would know what happened here. One federal agent leaned in close to Hayes. Sir, do you want us to remove them from the scene? Hayes shook his head, his eyes still locked on the officers. No. Let them stand here. Let them feel the weight of their actions. The commander swallowed hard, then addressed Hayes respectfully. Director. I give you my word, this will be handled internally. Disciplinary action will be swift. Hayes raised an eyebrow. Handled internally? No. This isn't going to vanish behind paperwork. What happened tonight will be documented. Officially. The officer's knees nearly buckled. The neighbors' cameras caught every word. And then, Hayes took a step closer, lowering his voice so only the two officers could hear. You thought you were teaching me a lesson. But tonight, I'm teaching you one. The tension was suffocating. The officers stood pale and rigid as more federal agents fanned out, securing the perimeter. The commander wiped sweat from his brow, realizing this scene was already far beyond his control. Then came the sound that sealed their fate, the unmistakable ping of phones going live. Several neighbors were no longer just recording. They were streaming. Unbelievable, one whispered into their phone. The FBI director just got handcuffed by local cops on his own property. The officers' faces drained of color. They weren't just dealing with their boss anymore, they were dealing with the entire internet. Director Hayes straightened his suit jacket, his expression steely as he glanced toward the cameras. He didn't need to say much, the look on his face told the story of a man wronged, but unbroken. The commander tried to salvage the moment. Director Hayes, if you'll allow us to escort you inside. Hayes cut him off. No. I want the community to hear this. Right here, right now. He turned slightly, his voice projecting across the street. For those of you watching, remember this moment. If two officers can treat the director of the FBI this way, imagine how easily an ordinary citizen could be mistreated. This is why accountability matters. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The live stream comments flooded in, hearts and shocked emojis flying across the screens. The commander's face darkened. He knew the fallout was already unstoppable. The two officers stood frozen, their eyes darting between the gathering crowd, the flashing live streams, and the unflinching stare of Director Hayes. Every second felt like an eternity. Hayes paced slowly in front of them, his presence commanding absolute silence. Then he stopped and spoke with deliberate weight. You tried to strip me of dignity on my own property. You failed. But tonight, you've exposed a much deeper problem, how easily authority can be abused when unchecked. The neighbors murmured in agreement, their cameras still rolling. The live streams were already reaching thousands. Hayes gestured toward the commander. I'm not here to ruin careers out of spite. But actions have consequences. These men will be suspended, effective immediately, and a full federal inquiry will be launched. And the public will see every step of it. The commander swallowed hard and nodded, unable to argue. Yes, sir. Consider it done. The younger officer looked like he wanted to plead, but one glance from Hayes silenced him. Then Hayes faced the crowd again, his voice carrying strength and clarity. Let this be a warning, to every officer, every official, every person who wears a badge. Power is not a weapon to be waved recklessly. It is a responsibility. And when it is abused, it will be held accountable. The neighborhood erupted with claps and shouts of approval. The live-streamed comments were exploding, turning Hayes's words into viral headlines before the night was even over. And for the first time since the ordeal began, the officers realized, they hadn't just embarrassed themselves. They had made national history. By the next morning, the story had already swept across every news network. Clips from the neighbors' live streams played on repeat, 2 local officers handcuffing the FBI director on his own front lawn. Headlines flashed across screens. Cops detain FBI director at his own home. Accountability speech goes viral overnight. The footage of Hayes standing tall, delivering his words to the neighborhood, had become the centerpiece of national debate. Millions praised his composure, while thousands demanded reform in policing standards. Inside FBI headquarters, reporters crowded outside the gates, hungry for comment. Hayes, however, remained calm and deliberate, choosing his moment carefully. That evening, he appeared at a press conference, his expression steady but fierce. The room fell silent as he approached the podium. What happened to me yesterday should never happen to anyone, he began, his voice measured and clear. I was treated like a criminal on my own property, not because of evidence, not because of suspicion, but because officers chose to act before verifying facts. That is unacceptable. He let the words hang in the air, then continued, this is not about me. This is about every citizen who doesn't have the title of director to protect them. If it can happen to me, it can happen to anyone. That is why reform and accountability are not optional. They are necessary. The flash of cameras lit up the room like lightning. Journalists scribbled frantically, knowing his words would shape tomorrow's headlines. And Hayes ended with a sentence that would echo across the country. No one, no matter the uniform they wear, is above the law. The crowd erupted, and the story, already viral, took on a life of its own. The fallout was swift. Within 48 hours, the 2 officers were officially suspended pending federal review. Their names were splashed across local broadcasts, their actions dissected on national panels. The commander who had tried to contain the mess faced his own investigation for negligence in oversight. Meanwhile, Director Hayes's speech had spread far beyond the neighborhood. Clips of him declaring, "No one is above the law," were replayed in classrooms, offices, and community meetings across the nation. Hashtags trended worldwide, and commentators praised him for turning humiliation into a powerful stand for accountability. In the weeks that followed, new policies were announced. Verification procedures were tightened. Training reforms were introduced. And every officer in the region was reminded, mistakes like this would never again be brushed under the rug. For Hayes, it was never about revenge. Standing in his office late one evening, he looked out across the city skyline, reflecting on the chaos that had begun so close to home. He whispered to himself, if this prevents even one innocent person from being treated the way I was, then it was worth it. The camera crews eventually left his neighborhood. The flashing lights faded. But the message endured. What began as a humiliating confrontation on a quiet suburban lawn had transformed into a national turning point. And the 2 officers who thought they had cornered a trespasser learned the hardest truth of all. They had laid hands on the one man whose job was to ensure justice for everyone. The investigation concluded within a month. The federal review found both officers guilty of misconduct, neglect of duty, and abuse of authority. They were dismissed from the force, careers ended in disgrace. The commander, though spared termination, was demoted and reassigned far from the city, a reminder to every department head of what failure to uphold standards would cost. But while the fallout hit the officers hard, for Director Hayes, the outcome became something bigger than punishment. His confrontation had sparked a movement. Citizens across the country demanded reforms in how officers approached everyday encounters. Community leaders echoed his words in town halls: "Power is not a weapon. It is a responsibility." Hayes himself became a symbol, not just of authority, but of accountability. He was invited to speak before Congress, where he urged lawmakers to implement nationwide policy changes that would ensure citizens were treated with dignity and fairness. Standing before senators, he delivered the same piercing truth that had first electrified his neighborhood. "If this can happen to me, the director of the FBI, it can happen to anyone. And that is why we must act. Because justice cannot be selective. It must be for all." The chamber fell into stunned silence before erupting into applause. That night, as Hayes returned to his home, the very place where it all began, he saw his neighbors waiting outside. Not with fear or whispers this time, but with smiles and respect. They applauded as he stepped from his car, not for his title, but for his courage to stand up for what was right. The memory of that night would never leave him. But neither would the lesson it carried. The officers had tried to strip him of his power. Instead, they had given him a platform to change the nation. And history would forever remember the night the FBI director turned humiliation into a movement.